Morning all. Keep this short and sharp, and then after a limited sleep watching the Matildas, we'll go and have some estimates fun. All good to go? It's official. Under the weakened laws of the state Labor government, Queensland is now the crime capital of the country. And Queenslanders aren't comfortable with that, and neither am I. And today is the day that the government has to acknowledge that the decision to deliberately water down the laws 8 years ago have created a generation of untouchables, repeat hardcore young offenders who know that their rights are greater than the rights of the victim. If you're a Queenslander today, you are twice as likely to be robbed, twice as likely to have your house or business broken into, and 3 times more likely to have your car pinched than if you live in New South Wales. How on earth did we get here? This is a proud state, and across Queensland, Queenslanders are asking for their community safety back. They want to feel safe in their homes, in their businesses, when they're on the streets. And these figures show the generation of untouchables are running amok. And the state government can talk all they like about their laws. They made a conscious decision to water them down 8 years ago, and they have created this crisis. And Queenslanders are deserving and demanding the laws to keep them safe. They also are demanding more blue uniforms to do that job. And the fact that there are 72 fewer police than 2 years ago shows you that the thin blue line has got thinner, the laws have been watered down, and on the back of it, this proud state has become the crime capital of the country under a very weak state Labor government. Jarrod.
Thank you, David, and good morning. Jarrod Bleijie, Deputy Leader of the Opposition. Well, it's the start of estimates this week, and the Premier and Treasurer are up today, and the Opposition is calling for an end to the dodgy protection racket. Queenslanders deserve answers as to why we are the crime capital of the country, why we have a housing and health crisis. All these issues that are so important to Queensland and should be the priority for the government, and they're simply not the priority of the Palaszczuk Labor government. We've seen less scrutiny over the years because we have had filibustering by ministers. We've had the chairs not acting in an impartial and independent way. That's why the Opposition is absolutely calling for an end to the dodgy protection racket. And I've got no doubt we will see it again this week as the government tries to sidestep the issues of transparency, openness, accountability. They will sidestep the questions. The chairs will no doubt interrupt our shadow ministers and committee members when we're speaking. They will try and rephrase the questions. We have seen it all before in the last 9 years of the Palaszczuk government. The culture is absolutely rotten. It is a rotten culture highlighted by the Coldrake inquiry. Now, if you want to talk about the shenanigans of the Palaszczuk government, the chaos and crisis of the Palaszczuk government, look no further than today. Today we see glossy brochures issued and new announcements about potential 1,500 homes being developed in the North Shore Hamilton area. Well, where have we heard this before? 2009. Anna Bleijie announced the same plan. Anna Bleijie announced the document for the Land Development Authority. It was Anna Bleijie's plan, and some 14 years later, they dust it off and announce it as if it's a new concept. The government have said they're looking this is one of the creative ways to solve the housing crisis in Queensland. Well, I'd say to the Deputy Premier and the Premier, it's not too creative to find out which land is owned by the state government, i.e. the taxpayers of Queensland, and work out ways to develop that land. It is clear that under the Labor Party in Queensland in the 9 years, building approvals have been on the decline, lot approval releases have been on the decline. This is the heart of the housing crisis. This is at the heart of the housing crisis that the state Labor government has not released enough land. So all they've done today, so the Premier can go into estimates and talk about the housing summit that she held, and a key element, they say, from the housing summit was an audit of state land. For goodness sake, how has the state government not known what land they own over the last 9 years looking at the housing issues? This housing crisis didn't just happen. It has been in the making for many, many years, and it's incumbent on the Premier and the State Development Minister, the Planning Minister, Stephen Miles, to explain themselves. So they're now saying the announcement today, 1,500 homes, potential homes, in the next 10 years. Queenslanders need a roof over their head now. Homelessness is out of control. And what the government have done today is just another example of why we have a housing crisis, because all they're interested in how things look and not the reality of the situation. And the reality of the situation is Queenslanders deserve action, and they deserve the housing crisis to be healed today. David.
Thanks, Jarrod. Over to you. It starts with consequences for actions and rewriting the Youth Justice Act to put the rights of the victim ahead of the rights of the offender. We want to unshackle the judiciary, remove detention as a last resort, and we want to get serious about gold standard early intervention. We also have to acknowledge that what's happening at the moment with victims is broken, and victims don't feel valued and they don't feel respected. So let me be very, very clear. My priority is to make sure that there are less victims. That's got to be the priority. We do have to acknowledge, though, at the moment, you've got a generation of victims who continue not to be listened to. So we commit to having a victims commissioner. We want to have a victim on the Sentence Advisory Board. We don't want victims to have to pay when they need to get a new licence or new number plates. But above all, we want less victims in the first place. And if we deal with both of those issues, if we rewrite the Act to put at the heart of it to make sure that there are less victims and we support the ones that are there, that's how you can turn around a generation of repeat hardcore young offenders. I also want to get serious about honouring the commitment to make sure that there are more police on the beat. And the fact that the government promised 1,450 additional police before the last election, and that number has gone backwards by 72, well, it just shows you weaker laws, fewer police. That is a cocktail for disaster. And these figures show, sadly, that Queensland is now the crime capital of the country. By listening and taking submissions and reflecting on those. And I think... Oh no, of course that's a government appointment. The board is currently appointed by the government, the Sentencing Advisory Council. I just think it's important that there's somebody who's sitting around the table who has walked in the shoes of Queenslanders who have woken up to the devastation of their car being pinched, or having to tell a loved one that you've had a bad man inside your house. And I think that's important. I think it's important that we reflect on that. And if you have a raft of people who see the world through different prisms, that's the way that you have a good reflective way of doing business across the board. And crime should be no different. But at the heart of what we are serious about achieving is to make sure that there are consequences for actions, and that the judiciary is unshackled so we can do their job. And we do get serious about early intervention. And I say this every time, and the Deputy Leader wrote to the Auditor-General, and we want to know what programs there are in Queensland at the moment, what's working, what's not. The government just doesn't seem willing to do that. And I'm not going to give up on young kids. And I am serious about turning around children before they fall into a generation of crime. And at the moment, we are failing offenders at both ends of the spectrum. And these figures show that Queensland is now the crime capital of the country. And it's not by a small amount. When you compare figures with other jurisdictions, it shows what has happened in Queensland as a result of the state government watering down the laws has broken the system and created a generation of untouchables, and Queensland is the crime capital of the country. Queenslanders aren't comfortable with that.
The Deputy Premier mentioned last week, remembering that removing detention as a last resort, I guess, be against the United Nations Charter on the Rights of the Child, and removing that would be, I guess, challenged in a legal setting. Does that concern you?
Well, they did say the same thing about breach of bail for the better part of 2.5 years, and mocked and derided the LNP for listening and putting that suggestion forward. And in the end, they adopted that legislation word for word. Now, without the police to enforce it, without genuine consequences for actions, without detention as a last resort, that was only ever going to be one small step. But I can't credibly take the feedback from a person who ran exactly the same arguments previously. I'll just make this point. We are on the side of Queenslanders, and we want to have a Youth Justice Act that enables consequences for actions for offenders, but also has the best gold standard early intervention to turn the next generation around. And if we do that, we can create a situation where people in this state feel safe in their homes, in their businesses, and that generation of untouchables is ended.
With the overhaul of estimates, I understand that when you ask questions on audits, an estimate not all of them have to be asked. It doesn't have to be asked.
Well, if you have a look at the answers to the questions as they come through, you will see the culture that exists at the moment in Queensland of ministers not answering questions, and that will change. But I also want to change the way that the hearings are conducted, and I pray it's different this year. I really do, but time will tell. But we have chairs who deliberately find every way to waste time, calling the same person who is asking a series of questions of the same minister. Now, that doesn't happen in other jurisdictions. It doesn't happen in Canberra. I look at the estimates, the committee process and the estimates process in other jurisdictions and in Canberra, and I see how it can work. It can work by having ministers answer questions and be held accountable. Here, it's a protection racket, and no one wins when that's the case. Queenslanders don't win, who are seeing a decline in services, and long term, a good government should be proud to have their ministers be scrutinised. That's a fundamental of Westminster. So I commit to having an independent person chair the estimates hearings. There's going to be less time for Dorothy Dixes, and ministers are going to have to answer questions, and they're going to be held to account, and a standard is going to be set, because the protection racket we've seen in the last few years cannot continue. Well, if you start with the fundamental principle of putting the rights of the victim ahead of the rights of the offender, and you rewrite the Act accordingly, that's your starting point. But the greatest consequence for action is to make sure that the protection blanket of detention as a last resort is removed. And that gives the judiciary the full suite of tools at their measure. If you get serious about making sure that the intervention strategies are fit for purpose, that provides consequences for actions as well. So across the board, if we are serious about dealing with this at all levels throughout the system, we can turn this around in the short and in the long term. All right. Thanks, everyone. Thanks.